The British Isles have a long history of immigration. Romans, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and in later centuries European Jews and Irish migrants. But for much of the 20th century, net migration was actually close to zero. It's only in the past couple of decades that net migration has substantially increased. Now, since 1962, immigration from Commonwealth countries such as India and Jamaica was around 2.5 million. But during the 60s and 70s, there was also a lot of net emigration, people leaving the UK to live in countries like Canada, Australia, and the United States. Net migration in the UK peaked in 2023 with a total of 700,000, or 1% of the total population. This was the highest level on record. It reflects long-term trends, shortages in the labour market, and short-term factors such as the end of COVID and the Ukraine war. Also very high student numbers. In 2022, nearly 500,000 student visas were granted. Now, migration is forecast to fall in the coming years, but still remain elevated by UK standards. But forecasting migration is not an exact science. It depends on geopolitical events, the state of the economy, and government policy. In 2023, the largest reason for migration was work and work dependence. The second largest reason was students and their dependents. Asylum counted for 88,000, and small boat crossings or unregistered migration was 29,000. Now, this was high by UK standards, but only 4% of net migration figures and just 0.05% of the population. Small boat crossings have increased significantly in recent years, some say since the Brexit vote in 2016, and so far 2024 is showing record figures for this time of the year. Legal migrants are eligible for healthcare and most benefits, but also contribute to government finances through paying tax. Studies suggest that EU migrants were net contributors to government finances. This is because most EU migrants were of working age. Also, the geographical proximity meant they were less likely to bring family members and also likely to go back home to retire. Non-EU migrants have a negative impact on finances, but better than UK-born citizens. And the results of this study is backed up by the government's own Migration Advisory Committee, which states that each additional migrant from the European Economic Area will make a net contribution of around 78,000 over their lifetime. Now, when researching the Danish economy, which is very interesting actually, but I did come across a 2018 study by the Danish government which claimed non-Western migrants to Denmark had a negative effect on public finances. Now, I don't know too much about that particular study, but the OBR do model that high levels of net migration will lead to lower government borrowing and improved public finances. There is a view that migration will cause lower wages, because if you increase the supply of labour, wages go down. But this is something of a fallacy, because it assumes supply increases, but not demand. Because if you get more people, you get more labour supply, but also more economic activity and more demand. So the net effect on wages is fairly limited in either direction. Now, the Bank of England had a study on the effect of immigration, and they suggest that a 10% rise in migration levels causes wages to fall by a barely noticeable 0.3%. However, they did say that for unskilled workers, the effect may be greater, a 2% fall in wages for every 10% rise in migration. And this is broadly similar to other literature and economic studies. Interestingly, one study found the biggest negative effect of immigration was on existing migrants themselves. This shows the level of net migration in the UK and changes in median wages. Now, there's no particular pattern from this, and I would say it's hard to draw too many strong conclusions, given that there's so many other factors but have negatively affected wages in recent years, such as austerity, low productivity, low growth, or other economic shocks. Now, one of the biggest concerns of immigration is the effect on house prices and rents. For example, rents have increased 22% in the past 2 years, and high levels of net migration are definitely a factor. In 2018, the Ministry of Housing used a model from the University of Reading suggesting that for every 1% rise in the number of households, house prices would rise 2%. So in theory, the 4.8 million increase in foreign-born households between 1991 and 2016 would in theory be responsible for house prices to be 21% higher than otherwise. Now, if this model is true, then in 2022, the net migration figure of around 600,000, about 1% of the UK population, this suggests that net migration would be responsible for house price inflation being 2% higher than otherwise. But I would like to add a caveat to this study because it's definitely on the extreme edge of the effect of a higher population on house prices. The Migration Observatory point to 3 studies which suggest a relationship is much closer to around 1% increase in immigration, leading to a 1% increase in house prices. So if you get a net migration of around, say, 300,000, 0.4% of the population, it could mean house price inflation is 0.4% higher than otherwise. So not entirely insignificant, but still pretty small. But I think it is fair to say, at least in the short term, high levels of net migration have a bigger effect on rents. Now, high levels of net migration do increase gross domestic product. If you have more people, the economy gets bigger. And if you use GDP statistics, GDP growth appears not too bad in the past 14 years compared to other G7 countries. But I don't think this is such a good guide to what the economy has actually done. If we take into account population growth, GDP per capita is much lower, very poor growth. Now, one of the biggest reasons for net migration is foreign students, but it is important to bear in mind that these make a big contribution. They pay around 20% of total university revenue. Foreign students benefit the UK economy by around £42 billion. It's a big credit item on the balance of payments. If you took away foreign students, it would increase the cost for domestic students who are currently subsidised by foreign students. And universities really face a lot of financial pressures at the moment. Foreign students is one of the few things that helps them to be make less losses. The UK has nearly 7 million people on waiting lists, which is a huge problem. And migration has been critical for filling many vacancies in the NHS, nurses, doctors, and also, of course, care workers. In 2022, 16.5% of NHS staff in England reported a nationality other than British, and it's a similar situation with care workers. If we had net zero migration, it would be definitely difficult to deal with the long waiting lists in the NHS. Now, whilst the UK population is forecast to rise, this is the ONS forecast, the ONS have ignored in their models falling fertility rates. UK birth rates are forecast to fall to around 1.2, leading to a shortage of young people. In the next 20 years, the proportion of people over 65 is going to increase very significantly, and that might increase pressure on higher migration to kind of balance the population. Now, in the UK, high levels of migration have been consistent with falling unemployment rates, one of the few successes of the UK economy. In fact, migration is often an economic response to labour shortages, and the UK has definitely had shortages in areas like lorry drivers, fruit pickers, care workers, teachers and doctors and things, and so migration has helped fill in those gaps. If you did see a big economic slowdown and rise in unemployment, you would almost certainly see a pretty quick fall in migration. So in a way, it helps labour markets be more flexible. So overall, immigration has pros and cons. The benefits include filling labour shortages, especially in healthcare. Most migrants are net contributors to government finances, and if the government uses the money, it can spend with some better public services. Migration can also be a solution to an ageing population. The costs of migration can include a potential small fall for unskilled workers. It could lead to upward pressure on rents, and it can lead to increased pressure on public services if the government is unwilling to invest. Now, sometimes, or quite often, immigration is used as a scapegoat for wider issues, like low wage growth, austerity, underfunded public services. And if you move suddenly to a net zero migration policy, you wouldn't magically solve these underlying issues. It is true to some extent that migration can put upward pressure on rents, but if you stop migration, it wouldn't on its own suddenly make housing affordable. The problems of the UK economy are much more wide-ranging than one particular issue, which are often exaggerated for political reasons. This video explains the real reasons for the UK's poor economic performance.